Hello, and welcome. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift away from your shoulders. There's nothing you need to do. Nowhere you need to be. Just let yourself be here, in this moment, as we drift together through a gentle story. Take a slow breath in, and let it go. Release any tension you might be holding. Your only task tonight is to rest, to let your mind wander softly through the quiet corners of history. Tonight, we're going to explore something beautifully simple. Something you've probably never thought about as you've drifted off to sleep. We're going to discover the story of a box. Just a simple metal box. And how it changed everything about the way our world connects. But don't worry about remembering any of this. Just let the story wash over you like gentle waves. Let's begin by drifting back in time. Back to a world before this simple box existed. Picture, if you will, a busy harbor. Centuries ago, where the work of moving goods from land to sea was done entirely by human hands. For most of human history, when ships carried cargo across the oceans, they carried what we call break bulk. Imagine each individual item. A barrel of wine from France. A crate of machinery from England. A bundle of fabric from India. Each one a different shape. A different size, each one unique. These weren't packed into anything standardized. They were simply items. Hundreds of different items. Thousands of them. All waiting patiently on wooden docks. Picture the docks in your mind. The smell of salt water and wood. The creaking of ropes. Everything moved at the pace of human muscle. There was a certain rhythm to it all. Slow. Methodical. Timeless. These goods arrived at the harbor in such variety. Some were packed carefully in sturdy barrels, their wooden staves bound with iron hoops. Others rested in wooden crates, built specifically for their contents. Still others were gathered into heavy burlap sacks, tied with rough rope. And some items, larger pieces of machinery, perhaps, or furniture. These were simply bundled together with canvas and cord. Each piece had its own character, its own shape, and this meant that each piece required its own special attention. Its own particular way of being handled. Now, let your mind drift to the work itself. Imagine the dock workers. Strong men with calloused hands, moving each of these items by hand. One by one, they would lift a barrel, carry it up a narrow gangplank, guide it down into the dark hold of a ship, position it carefully, then climb back up for the next item. And the next. And the next. Each piece of cargo might be touched, lifted, moved, set down, picked up again, dozens of times on its journey from the factory where it was made to the customer who would finally use it. Dozens of human hands. Dozens of moments where something could go wrong. And so ships would sit in port, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, just sitting there, rocking gently on the tide, while armies of workers moved through the holds like busy ants, arranging, rearranging, fitting odd-shaped cargo into every available space. It was like an enormous three-dimensional puzzle, played out in the dim light below deck. The ports themselves employed thousands upon thousands of dock workers. In every major harbor city, you could find entire neighborhoods where generations of families had worked the docks. It was hard work, honest work, but slow. So beautifully, impossibly slow by today's standards. Let's think about the costs for a moment. But don't let numbers trouble your relaxing mind. Just understand that the expense of loading and unloading cargo, of paying all those workers, of keeping ships idle in port for days on end. This expense was often greater than the cost of the actual journey across the ocean. Think about that gently. The ship could sail thousands of miles across the open sea. And yet the most expensive part of the journey was simply getting cargo on and off the vessel. And there were other problems in this old world. Problems that arose from having so many items, so many hands, so much time spent sitting on crowded docks. Theft was woven into the fabric of port life, with hundreds of workers moving through cargo holds, with goods sitting exposed on docks for days, with so many opportunities and so little oversight. Things disappeared. A few bottles from a crate of wine, a bolt of valuable fabric, small items that could slip into a pocket or under a coat. It wasn't that people were bad, but temptation and need lived side by side on those weathered docks. Damage, too, was simply accepted as the cost of doing business. A barrel might be dropped, cracking open and spilling its contents. A crate could be stacked carelessly, crushing the goods inside. Rain would sweep across exposed cargo on the docks, water seeping through canvas covers, ruining grain, staining fabric, warping wood. Weather was both friend and enemy to cargo. A storm could halt all work for days. Rain and salt spray took their toll on goods waiting to be loaded. And there was nothing to be done but accept it. This was simply how things were. Even the paperwork moved slowly. Each package, each barrel, each crate, each bundle had its own documentation. Bills of lading were tied to individual items. Customs inspectors had to examine and record each piece separately. The administrative work could take as long as the physical loading. Everything waiting in careful, patient lines. Picture the cities themselves. These ports weren't built on the outskirts. They couldn't be. They were woven right into the heart of the city. Ships needed to dock where the workers lived, where the warehouses stood, where the rail lines terminated, and so harbors sprawled through urban centers, taking up precious space, their warehouses and loading areas spreading through neighborhoods like roots through soil. All of this inefficiency, all of this slowness, it created a kind of ceiling on how much trade was possible. The world economy in those days wanted to grow. People wanted to buy and sell across greater distances. Manufacturers dreamed of global markets. But shipping, the physical act of moving goods, was the bottleneck. The narrow place where everything slowed to the pace of human hands and patient days. Long-distance trade was certainly possible. Ships had been crossing oceans for centuries, carrying spices from the east, bringing back silver and gold. But it was expensive, unpredictable. A voyage that should take weeks might take months if ports were backed up with cargo. Prices fluctuated wildly because no one could predict exactly when goods would arrive. And so the world waited, not knowing it was waiting, not knowing that a solution was possible, just accepting that this was the way of things. The eternal rhythm of ships and docks and human labor. Let these images drift through your mind now. The sound of waves against wooden hulls. The creak of ropes and pulleys. The calls of dockworkers echoing across the water. All of it moving at the pace it had always moved. Slow. Steady. Unchanging. Rest now in this old world for a moment. There's no hurry. Nowhere to go. Just the gentle rhythm of work that has been done the same way for centuries. Let it all blur softly at the edges as we prepare to drift forward through time. As we drift gently forward through time, let's discover together how the human mind began to imagine, to wonder, to ask quiet questions about whether things might be done differently. The idea of the container, of a box that could hold many things. This idea is actually much older than you might imagine. Let your mind wander back even further than before, to a time when coal was the fuel that powered the world. As early as the 18th century, in the green hills and industrial valleys of England, someone had a simple thought. Coal was being moved from mines to furnaces, from countryside to city, and it was heavy, dirty, difficult to handle. What if, instead of shoveling it loose, it could be placed in box-like containers? Picture these early containers in your mind. Wooden boxes, sturdy and practical, designed to hold coal. They were moved on boats along the narrow canals that threaded through the English countryside. A man named James Brindley, an engineer who thought carefully about such things. He designed boats with fixed slots built right into them. Spaces where these coal containers could nestle perfectly, slide into place, rest securely for their journey. It was elegant in its simplicity. And around the same time, in those final years of the 1700s, another thoughtful man named Benjamin Outram developed a system where coal containers could move from rail to canal, from one form of transport to another. The box stayed the same, only the vehicle beneath it changed. But here's what's important to understand, and let this wash over you softly. These early systems were beautifully practical for their specific purpose, but they were local. Each mine, each company, each region had its own design, its own size of box, its own way of doing things. A container designed for one canal boat wouldn't fit on another company's boat. A box made for one railway couldn't be used on a different line. They were like puzzle pieces from different puzzles, each perfect for its own picture, but incompatible with anything else. As we drift into the 19th century, the age of railways, let your mind picture the great iron horses beginning to crisscross continents. Steam and steel, smoke and speed. The world was becoming connected by these metal rails. And railway companies, always looking for efficiency, they too began to experiment with removable boxes, containers that could be lifted on and off flatbed cars. The thinking was sound. Why unload individual items when you could simply move the entire box? Many of these early containers were crafted from wood. Think of the carpenters who built them. Measuring, sawing, fitting boards together with care. Each box strong enough to hold cargo, light enough to be moved. But wood has its limitations. It warps in rain, splits in cold, wears down with use. And the sizes? Oh, the sizes varied so widely. One company might build boxes 8 feet long. Another preferred 10 feet. A third insisted on 12. There was no agreement. No standard. Each believed their way was best. Let's pause here and think about something else. Something that seems simple now, but was a profound challenge then. How do you lift a heavy box? If a container is filled with cargo, it might weigh thousands of pounds. Human strength alone cannot lift it. You need a crane, a mechanical advantage. But the cranes of the 19th century weren't designed for this kind of work. They were made for lifting individual barrels and crates, for handling odd-shaped cargo piece by piece. The technology for efficiently lifting large, heavy boxes. This simply didn't exist yet. The infrastructure wasn't ready. As time moved forward into the early 20th century, Europe's railways continued to test container transport. There was promise in the idea. In the United Kingdom, containers were used for mail and baggage, traveling on passenger trains, small sealed boxes that could be quickly loaded and unloaded. By the 1920s, systems emerged that could move containers from road to rail. Trucks would deliver boxes to railway terminals. Cranes would lift them onto flatbed cars. At the destination, they'd be lifted back onto trucks. It was better than loose cargo. It reduced handling. But it still lacked something essential. It lacked scale. The challenge wasn't just boxes. It was everything around the boxes. Different railway systems used different gauges, different widths between their rails. A train from France couldn't run on Spanish tracks. A German railway car couldn't roll through Italy. So even if you had containers, they still had to be unloaded and reloaded at every border. The dream of a box that could move seamlessly across continents, across oceans. This remained just a dream. And then came war. The Second Great War. And with it came urgent need. The military, always focused on logistics, on moving supplies quickly to troops across vast distances. They tested steel cargo boxes during World War II. Picture this gently. The United States military, sending supplies across the Pacific Ocean, island to island, trying to keep pace with the needs of soldiers fighting in jungles and on beaches thousands of miles from home. Speed mattered. Efficiency mattered. Every hour of loading and unloading was an hour that could cost lives. So they experimented with steel boxes. Stronger than wood. More durable. Capable of surviving rough handling and harsh conditions. These wartime containers proved their worth. They were useful. Practical. They showed what was possible. But when the war ended, when peace returned and soldiers came home, these container systems were largely abandoned. They were seen as temporary measures, wartime solutions, not something for the everyday world of commerce. After the war, in the late 1940s and into the 50s, experiments resumed across Europe and North America. companies and railways and shipping lines. They all returned to the idea. They could see the potential. They knew there was something there. But still there was no agreement. No consensus on size, on fittings, on how containers should be lifted or secured or stacked. Everyone was working on their own version of the same idea. Like different people trying to invent the wheel independently. Each creating something circular but incompatible with everyone else's design. Let this sink in softly. The idea existed. The concept was there. People understood that boxes could revolutionize transport. But an idea alone isn't enough. You need an ecosystem. You need ships designed to carry containers. Ports equipped with cranes to lift them. Railways with flatbed cars to haul them. Trucks built to carry them. And you need everyone to agree on the same size. The same fittings. The same standards. The world was close. So close to this revolution. But not quite there yet. All the pieces were floating separately, waiting for someone to see how they could fit together. Waiting for the right person with the right vision at the right moment. Let your mind rest here for now. In this in-between time, when the future was almost visible, almost within reach, but not quite yet. Now let's drift to a different kind of story. The story of one person. One mind that saw what others had missed. This isn't a story about an engineer or a shipping executive. At least not at first. This is the story of a man who started out simply driving a truck. His name was Malcolm McLean. And if you let your imagination wander, you can picture him as a young man. Hands on the wheel. Mile after mile of American highway rolling beneath him. The hum of the engine. The rhythm of the road. McLean was good at what he did. He understood trucks. Understood logistics. Understood the practical realities of moving goods from one place to another. And because he was good at it, because he worked hard and thought carefully, he eventually built something remarkable. One of the largest trucking companies in the United States. But success didn't make him stop paying attention. Didn't make him stop noticing things. And what he noticed, what he saw over and over again, were the ports. Picture him, sitting in his truck, waiting at a harbor, watching, always watching. His trucks would arrive at ports to deliver cargo to ships. And then they would wait, and wait, and wait. Sometimes drivers would wait for days, just sitting there, while down on the docks, armies of workers slowly, methodically, unloaded cargo from the trailers, piece by piece, barrel by barrel, crate by crate, everything touched by human hands, everything taking time, precious time. And McLean would look at his truck sitting idle, this expensive piece of equipment, doing nothing, going nowhere, just waiting while the cargo was painstakingly transferred to a ship. The truck itself, the trailer, it had already been loaded once, carefully packed by workers at a warehouse or factory. And now it was all being unpacked. Every item removed, only to be carried down and loaded onto a ship. And at the destination, it would all happen again in reverse. McLean began to think about this. to turn it over in his mind during those long hours of waiting. And slowly, a question formed. A simple question that no one else seemed to be asking. Why? Why did cargo have to be touched so many times? Why did it have to be unloaded and reloaded at every step? Why couldn't you just move the whole thing? Let your mind follow his thinking. Drift along with his realization. He imagined something radical. What if you could lift the entire truck body, the trailer itself, and just place it on a ship? The cargo would never be touched. It would stay in the same sealed container from the factory to the final destination. It seemed so simple, so obvious, and yet no one was doing it. McLean became convinced this was the answer. Not just an improvement, but a complete reimagining of how shipping should work. He envisioned a standardized box, the same size every time, that could move intact from truck to train to ship and back again. Never unpacked until it reached its final destination. But having a vision is one thing. Making it real is something else entirely. To pursue this idea, to turn it from imagination into reality, McLean made a bold decision. He sold his trucking company, the business he had spent years building. He took that money, that capital, and he bought a small shipping line. Traditional shipping executives watched this with skepticism. This truck driver, this outsider, coming into their industry with strange ideas. They had been running ships for decades, 4 generations. They understood the business, and they dismissed his concept. It wouldn't work. It couldn't work. Ships weren't designed for large boxes. The economics didn't make sense. This McLean fellow simply didn't understand shipping. The ports themselves weren't designed for what McLean envisioned. Docks were built for break bulk cargo, for cranes that lifted individual items, for warehouses that stored loose goods. Everything about port infrastructure assumed cargo would arrive as individual pieces. To handle large containers, you would need different cranes, different loading equipment, different storage systems. The ports would have to be completely reimagined. The railroads were skeptical too. They had their own systems, their own ways of doing things. They'd tried container transport before and found it only marginally useful. Why would this be any different? And then there were the dock workers. Thousands of them. In every port. Men whose fathers and grandfathers had worked these same docks. Their jobs, their livelihoods, depended on cargo being handled piece by piece. If containers could be loaded and unloaded by just a few workers with cranes, what would happen to everyone else? The fear was real. The resistance was understandable. McLean faced opposition from every direction. From established shipping companies, from ports, from railways, from unions, from people who had every reason to believe the current system was the only system, the natural order of things. But McLean pushed forward anyway. He had seen the waste, the inefficiency. He had watched his trucks sit idle while cargo was needlessly handled again and again. He knew there was a better way, and he was determined to prove it. Sometimes the most important changes come from outsiders, from people who aren't bound by industry tradition, who can see problems with fresh eyes. Malcolm McLean wasn't a shipping expert. And perhaps that's exactly why he could imagine something the experts couldn't. Let yourself rest now with this image. A man with a vision, facing doubt from all sides, but moving forward anyway. Convinced that something simple and obvious to him would eventually be obvious to everyone. The world was about to change, though most people didn't know it yet. A quiet revolution was forming, not in grand halls or government offices, but in the mind of a former truck driver who had spent too many hours waiting at docks, watching, thinking, seeing what others had missed. Now we arrive at a moment, a single point in time, where an idea becomes real. Let yourself drift back to the year 1956. The world is settling into the rhythms of the post-war era. Cities are rebuilding, economies are growing, and in a shipyard, something new is taking shape. Malcolm McLean has taken a ship, a World War II tanker, a vessel that once carried oil across oceans, and he is transforming it. Picture this scene softly. Workers cutting, welding, refitting, taking what was and making it into what could be. The ship is given a new name. The Ideal X. Ideal, as in perfect. The ideal solution. X, marking something new, something experimental, something that crosses from the old world into the new. This ship has been modified to carry 58 steel containers. Not thousands, not even hundreds, just 58. A modest beginning, a small test of a grand idea. These containers are loaded in Newark, New Jersey. Let your mind picture that harbor, the industrial waterfront, the skyline of New York City visible across the water. Workers guide the containers into position, secure them. Everything is new, untested. There's a careful attention to detail, a sense that something important is happening, even if no one is quite sure what it means yet. The Ideal X sets sail for Houston, Texas. A journey down the eastern seaboard, around Florida, into the Gulf of Mexico. The ship moves through the water just as ships have always moved. Steady, patient, propelled by engines and guided by experienced hands. But what's different? What makes this voyage revolutionary is what isn't happening. The containers remain sealed the entire journey. Think about that gently. From the moment they were loaded in Newark to the moment they would be unloaded in Houston. No one opens them. No one touches the cargo inside. The goods rest in darkness, undisturbed, protected. In the old way of shipping, cargo would have been exposed to weather, to salt spray, to the possibility of damage every time it was handled. But here, sealed inside steel boxes, the cargo is safe, protected from the elements, from careless handling, from the 1,000 small accidents that occurred in traditional shipping. When the Ideal X arrives in Houston, the transformation becomes clear. Loading the ship had taken hours instead of days. Think about that. Hours. The containers were lifted by crane, positioned on the deck, secured. The entire process moved at a pace that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. And unloading. Unloading was equally swift. The cranes lifted. The containers were placed on trucks. And they were gone, rolling away to their destinations while the ship sat in port for mere hours. Not days. Not weeks. Hours. The economic impact was immediate and undeniable. Cargo theft. That constant presence in the old ports. Dropped dramatically. How do you steal from a sealed steel box? The containers were locked at the point of origin. They weren't opened until they reached their destination. Opportunity for theft simply disappeared. Damage to cargo. Another accepted cost of traditional shipping. This too was reduced. Goods weren't being handled multiple times by different workers. They weren't exposed to weather. They weren't being bumped and jostled as they moved through cargo holds. They just rested safely in their steel boxes, undisturbed. And the costs. Let yourself absorb this gently. Shipping costs fell sharply, not by a small percentage, but dramatically. The expenses that had made long-distance trade so costly. The armies of dock workers. The days in port. The damage and theft. All of this was suddenly, almost miraculously, reduced. McLean had proven something that the experts said was impossible. He had shown that cargo could move faster, cheaper, more safely, more efficiently. The numbers didn't lie. The economics were undeniable. This voyage of the Ideal X, this single journey from Newark to Houston, demonstrated something profound. It proved that intermodal transport worked, that a container could move seamlessly from truck to ship, that the same box could travel by different modes of transport without ever being opened. Historians looking back often point to this moment, this voyage, as the birth of modern containerization. Not because it was the first time anyone had used containers. We've already drifted through those earlier experiments. But because this was the moment when someone put together all the pieces. The right size, the right handling equipment, the right economic model, the right vision of how it could all work together. Picture the workers on the docks in Houston, watching these steel boxes being lifted off the ship. Some of them must have sensed that something was changing, that the world of shipping they had known their entire lives was about to transform. Though perhaps they couldn't yet see how completely. The Ideal X was just the beginning, just the first small proof. But it was enough. Enough to show that McLean was right. Enough to demonstrate that the future of shipping would look nothing like its past. Enough to start a revolution that would reshape global trade. Sometimes the most important changes come quietly, not announced with fanfare, but proven simply by working, by being undeniably better than what came before. Let this moment rest in your mind. The Ideal X sailing into Houston, its cargo sealed and safe, its journey completed in a fraction of the time anyone expected. The world of shipping standing at the edge of transformation, about to step forward into a new era. Rest now with this image, this quiet triumph, this proof that a better way was possible. The revolution has begun, though gently, steadily, like the tide coming in. Inevitable, unstoppable. Now let's drift into the details, the quiet mathematics of design. Because a revolution isn't just about having a bold idea. It's about solving countless small problems, about refining and perfecting, about making something that works in theory work in the messy reality of the physical world. The early containers that sailed on the Ideal X. They were 33 to 35 feet long. Picture this length. Longer than most rooms in a house, but still small enough to fit on a truck trailer. 8 feet wide, the width of a hallway, and 8 feet tall, the height of a ceiling. These dimensions weren't chosen randomly. They emerged from practical considerations, from the realities of roads and trucks and railways, from what could be moved, what could be lifted, what could fit. The material itself underwent a transformation. Those early wooden containers from centuries past, they had to give way to something stronger, something more durable. Steel became the answer. Think of steel. Cold and strong, resistant to weather, to impact, to the constant abuse of being lifted and stacked and carried across oceans. Steel could be bent into corrugated walls, ridges running horizontally, giving strength while keeping weight manageable. A steel container could survive what would destroy a wooden one. But having a strong box wasn't enough. The real challenge was in the details, in the corners, in the connections, in all the small mechanical solutions that would allow these boxes to be handled efficiently. This is where we meet Keith Tantlinger, an engineer, a person who thought carefully about forces and stresses and how things fit together. He took McLean's vision and refined it, made it elegant, made it universal. Tantlinger created something called standardized corner castings. Picture the corner of a container in your mind. Not just a simple junction of walls, but a carefully engineered fitting. A block of solid steel with precisely machined holes and openings. These corner castings became the key to everything. They allowed a container to be lifted from any angle. A crane could attach to any corner, could hoist from the top or the bottom. The container became easy to handle because every corner was identical. Every corner was designed to receive the crane's lifting mechanism. And there were twistlocks. Such a simple name for such an elegant solution. These were mechanisms that could secure containers together. A twist lock would insert through the corner casting of one container into the corner casting of another. Then with a twist, a rotation, it would lock them together. Secure, stable, strong. This meant containers could be stacked. Picture this softly. One container on top of another, rising like building blocks. Each one locked to the ones around it. Each stack stable even in rough seas, even in high winds. The cranes themselves evolved with the containers. Gone were the old systems designed for grabbing individual barrels and crates. New cranes emerged, purpose-built for containers. They had spreaders, frames that would descend over a container, lock into all four corners simultaneously, and lift the entire box as a single unit. Manual labor, the muscle and sweat of thousands of dock workers, was replaced by the smooth efficiency of mechanical systems. A crane operator could move a container in minutes, a task that would have taken dozens of workers' hours to accomplish. The walls of the containers. Those corrugated steel panels. They weren't just for show. The corrugation added tremendous strength. Think of how a piece of paper, flat and flexible, becomes rigid when you fold it. The same principle at work. The waves in the steel made it resistant to buckling, allowed it to support enormous weight. These containers had to survive ocean storms. Picture a container ship in heavy seas. Waves crashing over the deck. The ship pitching and rolling. And through it all, these steel boxes remain secure. The corrugated walls flex slightly, absorbing stress. But they don't fail. They protect their cargo through conditions that would have been disastrous for traditional break-bulk shipping. Something subtle but important happened through all this engineering. The container itself became more than just a box. It became cargo handling equipment. Think about that distinction. In the old world, you had cargo, and you had separate equipment to move it. Ropes, hooks, nets, pallets. But a container, with its corner castings, its standardized dimensions, its structural strength, it was both the cargo and the handling equipment. It could be lifted, stacked, moved, transported, all because of how it was designed. The box and the system were one. This is what made containerization different from all those earlier attempts we drifted through. It wasn't just about putting goods in boxes. It was about creating a complete system, where the boxes, the ships, the cranes, the trucks, the trains, all worked together as a unified whole. Every corner casting was the same. Every container could be lifted the same way, secured the same way, stacked the same way. The standardization meant that a container loaded in Japan could be unloaded in Europe using the same equipment. The same procedures. No special adaptations needed. No unique solutions for each situation. Let your mind rest on the elegance of this. How engineering, careful thought about forces and materials and connections, transformed a simple idea into something that actually worked. That worked reliably. That worked everywhere. The container became a structural unit, an atomic element of global trade. Self-contained, self-supporting, universal. It was no longer about the individual items inside. It was about the box itself. The box that could go anywhere, carry anything, connect the world. Picture these containers now, stacked on ships, lined up in ports, rolling down highways on trucks. Their steel walls protecting cargo. Their corner castings waiting to be lifted. Their standardized dimensions fitting perfectly into a system that was rapidly spreading across the globe. Engineering is often invisible. We use the things engineers create without thinking about the careful thought behind them. But here, in these containers, in these corner castings and corrugated walls and twistlocks, was the infrastructure of a new world, the foundation of modern global trade. Let these details drift through your mind now. The mathematics of dimensions, the strength of steel, the elegance of a twistlock, the universality of standardization, all of it coming together. all of it enabling something revolutionary to emerge from something as simple as a box. Rest now with the knowledge that sometimes the most profound changes come through careful engineering, through attention to details, through solving small problems one by one until something entirely new becomes possible. As we drift forward through time, let's remember that change, even change for the better, is rarely welcomed with open arms. The world of shipping was about to be transformed. But transformation comes with struggle, with fear, with resistance. Let's explore this gently, with compassion for all those who faced an uncertain future. Picture a port. Any major port. In the early days after the Ideal X proved containers could work, the port had been built over generations, its docks extending into the water, its warehouses rising along the waterfront. Everything designed for the old way, for breakbulk cargo, for the familiar rhythms of manual labor. And now, someone is proposing that all of this must change. Completely. Fundamentally. Ports required massive redesign. Think about what this meant. You couldn't just add containers to existing facilities. The entire infrastructure had to be reimagined. Docks built for individual cranes handling barrels and crates were useless for lifting 40-foot steel boxes weighing tons. New cranes were needed. Enormous gantry cranes. Towering structures that would dominate the skyline. And these cranes were expensive. Tremendously expensive. A port authority had to invest millions of dollars, betting on a technology that was still unproven, still experimental. It was a leap of faith backed by enormous financial risk. Terminals needed large storage yards, vast open spaces where containers could be stacked, sorted, organized, waiting for their next journey. In the old system, cargo moved directly from ship to warehouse. But containers needed room. Acres and acres of paved ground. This meant ports needed more land. Much more land than they had ever needed before. Traditional docks. Those historic structures where generations of ships had moored. Where countless workers had spent their lives. These became obsolete overnight. Not gradually, not slowly, but suddenly. All that investment, all that infrastructure, all those familiar spaces, rendered useless by a simple steel box. But the most profound resistance, the most human resistance, came from the workers themselves. Let yourself understand their perspective, their fear. Dock workers had built their lives around the labor of loading ships. It was hard work. Yes, but it was steady work, honorable work, work that supported families, that passed from father to son. Labor unions saw what was coming. A crane operator and a few workers could do the work of hundreds. What would happen to everyone else? Where would they go? What skills did they have beyond the docks? The unions resisted automation, fought against it with every tool they had. And strikes erupted in major ports. Picture these scenes softly. Picket lines. Workers standing together, refusing to load containers, refusing to accept a future where they weren't needed. These weren't villains. They were people. People protecting their livelihoods. their communities, their way of life. The strikes could paralyze entire ports, halt commerce, create economic ripples that spread far beyond the waterfront. Cities faced economic disruption. Port cities had been built around shipping. Their economies depended on it. Entire neighborhoods housed dockworkers and their families. Shops, restaurants, schools, all supported by wages earned on the docks. If containerization meant fewer workers, it meant economic devastation for these communities. Local governments watched with concern. Some sided with the unions. Some tried to slow the adoption of containers. It wasn't just about technology. It was about people, about communities, about ways of life. Some ports refused to convert. They looked at the costs, the risks, the social disruption, and said no. We'll continue doing things the old way. Our system works. Why change? But shipping lines began to favor ports that could handle containers. Ships started bypassing traditional ports in favor of those willing to modernize. And slowly, reluctantly, the holdouts began to see that refusal to change was itself a kind of death. A slower death perhaps, but inevitable. Early container lines took huge financial risks. They were betting everything on this new system. Building special ships, negotiating with ports, investing in containers themselves, all while the outcome was still uncertain. Some companies failed, couldn't manage the transition, couldn't bear the costs. The early years of containerization left behind bankruptcies, broken dreams, companies that bet wrong or moved too fast or couldn't adapt. Adoption was uneven and slow. Some regions embraced containers quickly. Others resisted for years. A container might travel smoothly across one ocean, then hit a port that couldn't handle it, forcing a return to manual unloading. It was frustrating, inefficient, a hybrid world caught between old and new. But through all of this resistance, all of these growing pains, one truth became increasingly impossible to ignore. The productivity gains were undeniable. Ports that converted to containers could handle vastly more cargo with far fewer workers in a fraction of the time. The numbers were stark. A ship that once sat in port for weeks could now be loaded and sailing again in hours. The economic advantages were too great to ignore forever. And so, despite the strikes, despite the resistance, despite the very real human costs, containers kept spreading, port by port, country by country. The revolution continued, sometimes welcomed, often resisted, but always advancing. Let yourself hold both truths gently as you drift. This was progress, genuine improvement in efficiency and capability. But it was also loss. Real people lost jobs. Communities were disrupted. Ways of life ended. History remembers the triumph of containerization. But in those early years, for those who lived through it, it felt more like survival, like navigating uncertain waters, like watching the world transform and hoping you wouldn't be left behind. Picture a dockworker in those years, perhaps one who embraced the change, learned to operate a crane, adapted to the new system. And picture another, one who couldn't or wouldn't change, who watched their job disappear, their skills become obsolete. Both were part of this story. Both mattered. The revolution wasn't clean, wasn't simple. It was messy and human and complicated, as real change always is. But the container, that simple steel box, it kept moving forward, spreading across the globe, reshaping trade, reshaping ports, reshaping the very geography of how goods moved through the world. Let these images rest in your mind. The resistance and the inevitability, the fear and the progress, the human cost and the undeniable benefits. All of it true. All of it part of the story. All of it drifting now into memory as we move toward what came next. Now we drift into a different kind of revolution. Not one of steel and cranes, but one of agreement, of consensus, of the world deciding to speak the same language. This is the story of standardization, and it's more beautiful than you might imagine. In the 1960s, as containers were spreading unevenly across the globe, each shipping line still doing things slightly differently, a quiet organization stepped forward. The International Organization for Standardization, known simply as ISO. Picture this gently. Representatives from different countries, different companies, different perspectives, all gathering together, sitting around tables, trying to agree on something that seemed simple but was actually profound. What should a container be? They needed to agree on lengths, on widths, on heights, on how containers would connect to each other, on how they would be lifted. Every detail mattered because every detail had to work everywhere. In every port, on every ship, in every country. After much discussion, much negotiation, much compromise, standard lengths were agreed upon. The fundamental unit became the 20-foot container. Picture this in your mind. 20 feet long. A simple, manageable size. Small enough to be practical. Large enough to be useful. This 20-foot container became known as a TEU. A 20-foot equivalent unit. It became the language of global shipping. When people measured the capacity of a ship or a port, they spoke in TEUs. How many 20-foot containers can you handle? But 20 feet wasn't always enough. So the 40-foot container followed. Exactly double the length. Everything designed to work together. Two 20-foot containers occupied the same space as one 40-foot container. The mathematics were elegant, intentional, harmonious. Width and height were standardized too. 8 feet wide became the universal standard. 8 feet high for standard containers. Think about why. 8 feet matched the width of truck trailers in most countries. It fit within railway clearances. It was a number that worked across different systems, different infrastructures, and those corner fittings, those corner castings that Tantlinger had designed. They became universal. Every container in the world, regardless of who made it, regardless of where it came from, had identical corner fittings. Precisely the same dimensions, the same hole patterns, the same specifications. This might seem like a small thing, just a technical detail, but think about what it meant. A crane in Singapore could lift a container built in Germany. A twist lock made in Japan would fit a container from France. A ship designed in South Korea could carry containers from anywhere in the world. Containers could now move globally without modification, without adaptation, without special handling. A box loaded with electronics in Shenzhen could travel to Rotterdam without anyone needing to think about whether it would fit, whether it could be lifted, whether it was compatible. It just worked. Everywhere. Always. Rail, road, and sea became one system. Picture this transformation gently. A container begins its journey on a truck, driving through countryside. It arrives at a rail terminal, is lifted onto a flatbed car, travels hundreds of miles by train. Then it's lifted again, placed on a ship, crosses an ocean, and the process reverses. Ship to train to truck, and through it all, the cargo inside never moves, never shifts, never needs to be touched. Intermodal transport, moving between different modes of transportation, became routine. What had once been a dream, a distant possibility, was now just normal, expected. The container moved seamlessly because everyone had agreed on what a container should be. Containers became interchangeable worldwide. Think about that word. Interchangeable. It means that individual containers lost their uniqueness. One 20-foot container was functionally identical to any other 20-foot container. They could be swapped, substituted, mixed and matched without thought. This interchangeability was powerful. It meant shipping lines could pool containers, share them, rent them back and forth. A container that carried goods from Asia to Europe might return carrying different cargo from Europe to Asia. It didn't matter who owned it originally. It was just a standard unit, a common tool, available to everyone. Standardization removed friction. Every time something is unique, custom, special, it requires thought, planning, adaptation. But when everything is the same, it just flows, like water finding its level, like a river following its course. The containers moved through the global system with minimal resistance because the system was designed around them. Let your mind appreciate the cooperation this required. Countries that competed economically, companies that were rivals, they all had to agree. They had to surrender their individual preferences for the common good. They had to accept that the benefit of universal standards outweighed any advantage of having their own unique system. This is how the world becomes connected. Not through conquest or domination, but through agreement, through consensus, through recognizing that speaking a common language benefits everyone. The ISO standards transformed containers from a clever idea into the infrastructure of globalization. Before standardization, containers were helpful but limited. After standardization, they became universal. They became the default, the foundation, the assumed way that goods would move. Picture the global shipping network now. Containers flowing like blood through veins. From factory to port to ship to port to truck to warehouse to store. Each container just one cell in a vast organism. Each one interchangeable with millions of others. All moving together in a coordinated dance of commerce. Standardization meant you could plan. You could predict. You could optimize. A shipping line could design a ship knowing exactly what size containers it would carry. A port could build cranes knowing exactly what they would lift. A truck manufacturer could design trailers knowing exactly what would fit. The certainty that standardization provided. It allowed investment, innovation, growth. Because when you know the rules won't change, when you know that a container will be the same tomorrow as it is today, you can build systems that will last decades. Let this realization drift through your mind softly. That sometimes the most important innovations aren't new inventions, but agreements. Moments when the world decides to work together. To use the same measurements. To speak the same language. To make things that fit together seamlessly. The container didn't just standardize boxes. It standardized global trade. It created a common platform on which the entire world economy could build. And from that platform, from that shared foundation, came everything that followed. Rest now with the image of these containers. All the same. All compatible. All interchangeable. Moving through a world that had agreed. Finally agreed. On how to connect. How to trade. How to share. The revolution was no longer about whether containers would succeed. It was about how they would reshape everything. Let's drift now to a difficult chapter. A time when innovation and conflict intersected. When the machinery of war accelerated the technology of peace. This is a complicated story, but we'll move through it gently, understanding both the tragedy and the transformation. In the 1960s, the United States became increasingly involved in a war in Vietnam. A conflict fought in jungles and rice paddies thousands of miles from American shores. And wars, regardless of their purpose or outcome, have always required logistics. The movement of supplies, the delivery of equipment, the constant flow of materials to support troops in the field. The US military looked at the container, this innovation that was slowly spreading through commercial shipping, and they saw a solution to their logistics challenges. They had used containers before, in World War II, but those had been temporary measures. Now they would embrace them fully, systematically, at scale. The military adopted containers during the Vietnam War. Picture this. Ships loaded with standardized containers, each one sealed, each one carrying ammunition, food, medical supplies, equipment, everything an army needed, sailing across the Pacific to Southeast Asian ports. Containers sped supply delivery. In traditional military logistics, supplies arrived as loose cargo, had to be sorted, organized, distributed. All of this took time. Precious time when soldiers were waiting for supplies, when every delay could matter. But with containers, supplies could be pre-packed at bases in the United States, organized by type, by destination, by priority. The containers were sealed, loaded on ships, and delivered directly to where they were needed. The time from warehouse to battlefield was cut dramatically. The military didn't just use containers. They invested in them. Military investment built ports and terminals. In Vietnam, in other locations throughout Asia and the Pacific. These weren't civilian investments. They were military infrastructure. But they served the same purpose. They created the capacity to handle containers. They proved that even in challenging conditions, even in developing regions, container ports could be built and operated effectively. Container ships were ordered at scale. The military needed vessels, many vessels, to support the war effort. So shipyards built container ships, gaining experience, refining designs, learning how to construct these specialized vessels efficiently. When the war eventually ended, when military demand decreased, these ships didn't disappear. They entered commercial service. The fleet of container ships grew not just through commercial investment, but through military procurement that transitioned to civilian use. Global confidence in containers grew through this military adoption. Business leaders watched the military move vast quantities of supplies with unprecedented efficiency. They saw that containers could work even under difficult conditions, even in ports that weren't fully developed, even when speed and reliability were absolutely critical. If the military trusted containers, if they were willing to bet military operations on containerized logistics, then surely containers were ready for commercial shipping. The military's endorsement, unintentional though it may have been, legitimized the technology in the eyes of cautious business executives. Commercial shipping followed the military's lead. Shipping lines that had been hesitant, that had watched from the sidelines, they began to invest. They ordered their own container ships. They converted their fleets. They committed to the container revolution because the military had proven it worked. There's something bittersweet here. Something to hold gently in your mind. War, conflict, human tragedy. It accelerated innovation. The urgent need to supply troops, to maintain military operations. It pushed containerization forward faster than commercial interests alone might have. The technology would have spread eventually. The economic advantages were too clear. But war compressed the timeline, forced investments that might have come more slowly in peacetime, created infrastructure that would serve commerce for decades after the conflict ended. Picture those ports in Vietnam and throughout Asia, built rapidly during wartime. Concrete and steel rising in places that had been simple harbors. After the war, these facilities remained. They became commercial ports, connecting Asian economies to global trade, helping to launch the manufacturing boom that would reshape the world economy in coming decades. The container ships built for military service. They sailed on, carrying not ammunition but consumer goods. Not military equipment but the raw materials of commerce. The infrastructure of war became the infrastructure of peace, transformed by the simple passage of time and the changing needs of the world. Let yourself understand this complexity. Innovation doesn't follow simple paths. Sometimes progress emerges from difficult circumstances. Sometimes technology developed for one purpose finds its true calling in another. The containers didn't care whether they carried military supplies or commercial cargo. They just did what they were designed to do: move goods efficiently from place to place. The Vietnam War was a tragedy, a conflict that caused immense suffering, that divided nations and cost countless lives. We don't celebrate war. We don't glorify conflict. But we can acknowledge, quietly, gently, that even in darkness, even in difficult times, human innovation continues. Systems develop, infrastructure is built, and sometimes that infrastructure serves purposes its builders never imagined. By the early 1970s, as the war wound down, containerization was no longer experimental, no longer a bold gamble. It had been tested under the most demanding conditions possible. It had proven itself not just in commercial ports but in the chaos and urgency of military operations. The acceleration was complete. What might have taken decades happened in years. The shipping industry had been transformed. The infrastructure was in place. The ships were sailing. The standards were agreed upon. And the world was ready, finally ready, for the full flowering of containerized global trade. Let these thoughts drift now. The complicated relationship between conflict and progress. The way that necessity drives innovation. The bittersweet knowledge that something good can emerge from something difficult. Rest with the image of those ships, sailing across oceans, carrying their standardized boxes, serving first one purpose and then another, adapting, enduring, connecting the world whether in war or peace. Now let's drift into a time of profound transformation, when the physical landscape of global trade was completely reimagined. Cities changed, shorelines were redrawn, the very shape of ships evolved. This is the story of how containers reshaped the world you can see and touch. Purpose-built container ships emerged. Let your imagination picture these vessels. They weren't converted tankers like the Ideal X. They weren't modified cargo ships trying to adapt. These were designed from the beginning, from the drawing board, to carry containers and nothing else. The holds of these ships, the spaces below deck where cargo was stored, they were transformed into something called cellular holds. Picture a grid, a three-dimensional lattice of metal guides. Each container would slide into place, guided vertically by these steel channels. Think of it like a filing cabinet, each drawer sliding into its designated space. This cellular structure meant containers couldn't shift during the voyage, couldn't slide around in rough seas. Each box was held firmly in position, supported by the structure around it. Ship loading became safer, faster, more predictable. Containers were lowered into their cells, one by one, stacking perfectly, efficiently, beautifully. On deck, on the docks, on the shorelines of ports, gantry cranes began to dominate skylines. Picture these enormous structures, towering over the water, their long arms reaching out over ships. capable of lifting containers from deep in the hold or high on the deck. These weren't the small cranes of the old ports. These were engineering marvels. Massive machines that moved on rails along the dock, precisely positioning themselves over each container. They're spreaders. Those frames that locked onto container corners could lift 40 tons as easily as you might lift a book. But here's what's important to understand. And let this wash over you gently. These new ships, these enormous cranes, they needed different ports. Deeper water, wider channels, more space. They couldn't fit in the old harbors, couldn't navigate the narrow passages into city centers. And so ports moved away from city centers, away from the historic waterfronts where ships had docked for centuries, away from the heart of urban life, out to deeper water, to places where there was room to build the vast terminals that container shipping required. Old docks were abandoned. Picture these places in your mind. Wooden piers that had seen centuries of use. Warehouses built in the 1800s. Narrow streets designed for horse-drawn carts. All of it suddenly obsolete. Suddenly quiet. The ships stopped coming. The workers left. The buildings stood empty. Ghosts of a previous era. But abandonment can lead to rebirth. Those old waterfronts, no longer needed for shipping. They were redeveloped. Imagine these transformations gently. Warehouses converted into apartments and restaurants. Old piers became parks and promenades. Cities reclaimed their waterfronts, turned them from industrial zones into spaces for living, for leisure, for beauty. If you've ever walked along a renovated waterfront, enjoyed a meal in a restaurant overlooking the harbor, lived in a loft apartment in a converted warehouse, you've experienced this transformation, the shift from industrial port to urban amenity. A change made possible because the containers moved elsewhere. Meanwhile, in new locations, sometimes miles from the old ports, new deep water terminals were built. These were vast facilities, acres upon acres of concrete, row after row of stacked containers, gantry cranes marching along the docks, ships so large they dwarfed the buildings of nearby towns. These new ports operated differently. A hub-and-spoke system emerged. Picture this like a wheel, with a central hub and spokes radiating outward. Major ports became hubs, places where the largest ships could dock, where cargo from across the world would arrive, be sorted, be redistributed. From these hubs, smaller ships called feeder ships served smaller ports. Containers would arrive at a major port on a huge vessel, then be loaded onto smaller ships that could navigate shallower waters, reach regional ports, deliver to places that couldn't accommodate the giants of the ocean. This hub-and-spoke system was more efficient than having every ship visit every port. It meant the biggest ships could focus on the longest routes, traveling between major hubs, while smaller vessels handled the distribution. It was like a transportation network, with major highways and local roads, each serving their purpose. The ships themselves kept growing, and growing, and growing. Early container ships might carry a few hundred containers. But as the system matured, As ports built bigger cranes and deeper berths, ships expanded, vessels carrying thousands of containers, then tens of thousands, floating cities of steel and cargo crossing the oceans. Think about the scale gently. A modern container ship can be longer than the Empire State Building is tall, can carry over 20,000 containers, can transport hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo with a crew of just 20 or 30 people. The efficiency is almost hard to comprehend. Cities themselves were transformed by these changes. Port cities that had built their identities around their harbors, that had grown up alongside shipping. They had to reimagine themselves. Some embraced the change, relocated their ports and reinvented their waterfronts. Others struggled, lost their connection to maritime trade, had to find new economic purposes. Picture a city like San Francisco, or London, or any historic port city. Their old ports, once centers of commerce and employment, became historic districts, tourist attractions, residential neighborhoods. The actual work of shipping moved to Oakland, to Felixstowe, to modern terminals built for efficiency rather than proximity to city centers. This physical transformation, this reshaping of ports and ships and cities, it happened relatively quickly. Within a generation, the world's ports looked completely different. The ships were unrecognizable compared to earlier vessels. The geography of trade had been redrawn. And yet, for most people, these changes happened quietly. In the background, you might notice that the old warehouse district downtown had been converted to condos. You might read about a new port being built. But the full scope of the transformation, the complete reimagining of how trade physically happened, it wasn't something most people thought about. The containers just kept moving, arriving at new ports, stacked by enormous cranes, loaded onto ships that looked like floating walls of steel. All of it working so efficiently that it became invisible. Infrastructure so reliable it disappeared from consciousness. Let these images drift through your mind now. The old waterfronts reclaimed. The new ports rising beside deep water. The enormous ships gliding across oceans. The gantry cranes dancing their precise mechanical dance. Cities transformed. Trade transformed. The physical world reshaped by the simple decision to put cargo in standardized boxes. Rest with this transformation, this quiet revolution in steel and concrete, this reshaping of shorelines and skylines, all in service of moving goods more efficiently from place to place. We arrive now at the heart of the story. At the moment when we can see clearly what the container really accomplished. It wasn't just about shipping. It was about transforming the entire global economy. About making possible a world that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Let's explore this gently. This quiet revolution that changed everything. Freight rates fell dramatically. Picture what this meant. Not just small improvements, not just marginal gains, but a complete transformation of the economics of trade. The cost of moving a typical cargo across the ocean, from factory to customer, it dropped to a small fraction of what it had been. Suddenly, distance mattered less. A factory in Asia could ship goods to Europe or America for relatively little cost. The ocean, once a barrier that made long-distance trade expensive and risky, became just another step in the journey, almost as mundane as moving goods across town. Shipping became predictable, and this predictability was perhaps more important than the cost savings. In the old days, you might ship goods and have only a vague idea when they would arrive. Weather, port delays, handling problems, all of it introduced uncertainty, unpredictability. But with containers, ships ran on schedules, departure times, arrival times. They could be predicted with accuracy. Businesses could plan around these schedules, could coordinate their operations, knowing when supplies would arrive, when products could be shipped. This predictability enabled something called just-in-time manufacturing. Let your mind understand this concept softly. Instead of storing vast quantities of parts and materials, just in case you might need them, manufacturers could order exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it, confident it would arrive on schedule. Think about what this meant. Factories didn't need enormous warehouses, didn't need to tie up capital in excess inventory. They could operate leaner, more efficiently. Parts and materials would arrive in containers, be unloaded, move directly to the factory floor. The container itself became a mobile warehouse, a storage unit that was always in motion. Asian manufacturing boomed, particularly in places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and eventually China. These countries could now manufacture goods efficiently and ship them anywhere in the world reliably and cheaply. The container made distance almost irrelevant. A toy made in China, electronics assembled in Taiwan, clothing sewn in Bangladesh. All of it could reach American or European customers for pennies per item in shipping costs. The container enabled the geographic separation of manufacturing and consumption. You could make things wherever it was most efficient, and sell them wherever people wanted to buy. Retail supply chains globalized. Picture the stores where you shop. The shelves filled with products from around the world. Coffee from Colombia, electronics from Japan, clothing from Vietnam, furniture from Sweden, all of it arriving in containers, moving through a global supply chain that had become routine, ordinary, expected. Before containers, most products were made relatively close to where they were sold. It was simply too expensive and complicated to source globally. But containers changed the calculation, made it economical to search the entire world for the best combination of quality and price. Container leasing companies emerged. And this is interesting to think about. Companies realized they didn't need to own containers. They could lease them, rent them for specific journeys, return them when done. This flexibility made containerized shipping accessible to smaller companies, to businesses that couldn't afford to invest in their own container fleet. But flexibility created its own challenge. Empty containers became a logistics puzzle. Think about this gently. Trade isn't balanced. The United States imports more from Asia than it exports. So containers arrive full and need to return empty, or be stored. or be moved to where they are needed. Empty containers began accumulating in ports, stacking up in storage yards. A container returning empty across the ocean. It still costs money to ship, still takes up space on a vessel. The logistics of managing empty containers, positioning them where they are needed for the next shipment. This became a constant challenge, a hidden complexity in the global system. Double-stacked trains increased inland efficiency. In North America particularly, railways realized they could stack containers too high on specialized flatbed cars. Picture this: a train stretching for miles, each car carrying 2 containers stacked on top of each other. It doubled the capacity of each train, made rail transport even more efficient. These double-stacked trains became a common sight, moving silently through countryside and cities, carrying goods from ports deep into the interior of continents. The container's journey didn't end at the coast. It continued inland, reaching places hundreds or thousands of miles from the ocean. Inland dry ports developed. These were container terminals built far from any ocean, in the middle of continents. Places where containers could be loaded and unloaded, stored and distributed. All the functions of a seaport, but connected to the ocean by rail rather than by direct access to water. Think about cities like Dallas, or Memphis, or Kansas City, deep in the interior of the United States. Yet they became major logistics hubs, handling containers as routinely as coastal ports. The container made geography flexible, made it possible to move port functions wherever they made economic sense. Through all of this, containers quietly powered globalization. Not alone. Certainly, globalization had many causes, many enablers, but the container was fundamental. It was the physical infrastructure that made everything else possible. Without cheap, reliable container shipping, you couldn't have global supply chains. You couldn't have just-in-time manufacturing. You couldn't economically source components from a dozen countries and assemble them in another. You couldn't fill stores with products from around the world. The container didn't cause globalization, but it enabled it, made it practical, made it economical, made it routine. It turned what had been expensive and risky into something ordinary and reliable. Let your mind hold this gently. The world you know, the global economy that surrounds you, the products you buy, the way businesses operate, all of it built on the foundation of standardized steel boxes moving across oceans, through ports, along railways, on highways. Most people never think about containers. They are invisible infrastructure, working quietly in the background. But they are everywhere, enabling everything, connecting everything, making possible the complex global economy that feels so natural we forget it's actually quite new, quite revolutionary, quite dependent on a simple innovation from the 1950s. Picture one container now, just one of millions, loaded at a factory, sealed, lifted onto a truck, driven to a port, lifted by crane onto a ship, sailing across an ocean, lifted off at another port, loaded onto a train, traveling inland. lifted onto another truck, delivered to a warehouse, finally opened, its contents distributed to stores. That one container, one of countless others, moving through a system so vast and complex and yet so reliable that we take it completely for granted. That's the revolution. That's what globalization looks like. A steel box, 20 or 40 feet long, carrying the stuff of modern life. Let this understanding drift through your mind now. The container as more than just a box, but as a building block of the modern world. An innovation so fundamental it reshaped economies, altered geographies, changed how we think about distance and trade and connection. Rest now with the knowledge that sometimes the most important innovations are the ones we stop noticing. The infrastructure that becomes invisible because it works so reliably. The revolution that succeeds so completely it feels like it was always there. The container changed the world. Quietly, efficiently, one box at a time. And the world it created, the global, connected, trading world we inhabit. We often forget that it's less than one human lifetime old. That our grandparents knew a world where this was impossible. Where globalization existed only in theory. Where distance still mattered deeply. Let these thoughts drift away now. Let the story of the container settle gently in your mind. You don't need to remember. Let's drift now into an era of growth, of expansion, of pushing boundaries. The container system had proven itself, had become essential. And now the question became, how far could it go? How big could ships become? How efficient could the system be? Let's explore this gently. This age of optimization and scale. Ships grew, and grew, and grew. Those early vessels that carried hundreds of containers. They were just the beginning. Picture the progression softly. Ships carrying 1,000 containers. Then 2,000. Then 5,000. Each generation larger than the last. Each pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible. Engineers and shipbuilders kept asking, why stop? If containers are standardized, if ports can build bigger cranes, why not make the ships larger still? More containers per voyage meant better economics, lower cost per unit, greater efficiency. And so the ships continued to expand. Post-Panamax ships emerged, vessels too wide to fit through the Panama Canal. That historic shortcut between oceans, built in the early 20th century, suddenly became a limitation rather than an enabler. These new ships were simply too large. They had to sail around continents, take the long routes, but their size made it economical anyway. Eventually, megaships surpassed 20,000 TEU, 20,000 20-foot containers, or 10,000 40-foot containers. Picture trying to visualize this. A single ship carrying the cargo of tens of thousands of trucks. One vessel doing the work of what would have required hundreds of ships in the old breakbulk era. These megaships were marvels. Longer than many city blocks. Wider than highways. Stacked so high with containers they looked like floating apartment buildings. Moving across oceans with surprising grace despite their enormous size. But bigger ships required bigger infrastructure. Ports had to dredge deeper channels. Picture this work. Dredging ships, removing sediment from harbors. Digging deeper, wider, creating the depths needed for these massive vessels to navigate safely. Some ports couldn't afford these improvements, couldn't accommodate the megaships, and so they watched trade shift to competitors who could. Automation entered terminals, gradually at first, then more completely. The work that had once required hundreds of human hands began to be performed by machines, guided by computers, operating with mechanical precision. Straddle carriers appeared in ports. Picture these strange vehicles, tall machines that could drive over a container, lift it, carry it, stack it, all without human hands touching the cargo. They looked like enormous insects, moving purposefully through container yards, picking up boxes, setting them down, all orchestrated by software and sensors. Automated stacking cranes emerged too, rising high into the air, moving on rails through storage yards, lifting containers and placing them in precise positions. These cranes could work around the clock, never tiring, never needing brakes. Just the steady hum of electric motors and the controlled movement of steel and cargo. The container itself evolved, diversified, no longer just a simple steel box. Refrigerated containers enabled global cold chains. Think about this gently. Containers with built-in cooling systems, maintaining precise temperatures, allowing fresh fruit from South America to reach Asia, allowing frozen goods to travel anywhere in the world. The refrigerated container made perishable goods global commodities. Tank containers appeared, specialized containers designed to carry liquids, chemicals, oils, wine. Anything that flowed could now move in standardized containers. Secure, sealed, easy to handle with the same equipment that moved regular boxes. Flat racks handled oversized cargo. Containers without sides, just a floor and corner posts, allowing machinery or equipment that wouldn't fit in a standard box to still benefit from containerized handling. The system was becoming flexible, adaptable, able to accommodate almost anything. High-cube containers increased volume. Standard containers were 8 feet tall, but some cargo needed more height. High-cube containers added an extra foot. 9 feet 6 inches tall. More space for goods that were light but bulky. Another small innovation that expanded the system's capabilities. Digital tracking and EDI systems emerged. EDI, electronic data interchange. Let this wash over you. The paperwork that had once been physical, bills of lading on paper, customs forms filled out by hand, all of this moved into computers, into digital systems that could communicate instantly across the globe. Now you could track a container, know exactly where it was, what ship it was on, when it would arrive. The container became visible in a new way. Not physically, but digitally. Its location, its status, its entire journey recorded and accessible. This digital layer, this information flowing alongside the physical movement of containers. It made the system even more efficient. Problems could be identified quickly. Routes could be optimized. Delays could be anticipated and managed. The containers moved through a world of data as well as a world of steel and concrete. Through all of these changes, through the growth and automation and specialization, the fundamental principle remained the same. Standardization, interchangeability. A 20-foot container was still a 20-foot container. Whether it was refrigerated or standard, whether it was tracked digitally or not, the system worked because it maintained compatibility even as it evolved. Picture a modern container port now. Enormous ships arriving with clockwork regularity. Automated cranes unloading containers at impressive speed. Straddle carriers moving boxes through vast storage yards. Computers tracking every movement, optimizing every decision. The efficiency would seem like magic to someone from the 1950s. Yet it all flows from that same simple innovation. The standardized box. The humans in this system. Their role has changed. No longer manual labor, moving individual pieces of cargo. Now they are operators, supervisors, technicians, managing machines, monitoring systems, solving problems that require human judgment. The work is different, requires different skills, but it's still essential. The automation hasn't eliminated people, just transformed what they do. Let yourself marvel gently at this progression. From McLean's 58 containers on the Ideal X, to megaships carrying 20,000, from manual labor on crowded docks, to automated systems working through the night, from paper records tied to individual packages, to digital systems tracking millions of containers simultaneously. The container system had matured, had optimized itself, had become a finely tuned global machine, moving with remarkable efficiency, handling unimaginable volumes, connecting the entire world through a network of standardized boxes and the infrastructure built to move them. And yet, as we'll discover, even systems this large, this sophisticated, this essential, they have their vulnerabilities, their fragilities. Sometimes optimization creates risks of its own. But let's rest here for now, in this moment of apparent triumph, when the container system seemed to have solved all its problems, when bigger and faster and more automated seemed like the path to perpetual improvement. Now we must drift into more recent times, into a chapter that revealed something important, something that the decades of growth and optimization had hidden. The container system, for all its efficiency, for all its sophistication, was more fragile than anyone had realized. Let's explore this gently, with understanding rather than judgment. Container imbalance worsened globally. Remember we spoke of empty containers. How trade isn't balanced. This problem grew more severe as trade volumes increased. Massive imbalances developed. More containers flowing east to west than west to east. More heading north than south. The logistics of moving empty boxes, positioning them where they were needed. It became increasingly complex, increasingly costly. At the same time, shipping lines built more ships, ordered more capacity. Everyone wanted to serve the growing trade. But sometimes, there were too many ships. Overcapacity, more vessels than cargo needed. When this happened, shipping lines adopted something called slow steaming. Picture this: ships deliberately moving slower than they could, reducing speed to save fuel, to stretch out journeys, to keep vessels occupied even when there wasn't enough cargo to fill all the ships in the fleet. It was economical in a narrow sense, but it revealed an underlying problem, an industry that had perhaps grown too large too fast. Supply chains became tightly optimized. Just-in-time manufacturing, minimal inventory, everything coordinated with precision, containers arriving exactly when needed. No sooner, no later. This optimization was efficient, incredibly efficient. But efficiency often comes at the cost of resilience, of flexibility, of the ability to handle disruption. Think of a tightrope walker, perfectly balanced, moving with grace and precision, but with no margin for error, no room to recover from an unexpected gust of wind. That's what global supply chains had become. Perfectly tuned, but vulnerable. And then, in early 2020, COVID-19 emerged, a global pandemic. Let's hold this gently, thinking of all who suffered, all who were lost. The pandemic was first and foremost a human tragedy, but it also revealed the fragility of systems we had come to take for granted. COVID-19 disrupted container flows in ways no one anticipated. Factories shut down, then restarted at different times in different places. Consumer behavior shifted dramatically. People stopped buying services, stopped traveling, and instead bought goods. Products, things that had to be shipped. The demand for containers surged, but containers were in the wrong places. Empty boxes sat in inland depots while ports needed them desperately. The system, so carefully optimized, couldn't adapt quickly enough to these rapid changes. Ports became congested. Picture this scene: ships anchored offshore, waiting days, sometimes weeks, for a berth to open. Containers stacking up in port storage yards. Trucks queuing for hours to pick up cargo. The smooth flow that everyone had taken for granted. It ground almost to a halt. Labor shortages compounded the problem. Port workers falling ill or quarantining. Truck drivers unavailable. The human element, so often invisible in discussions of automation and efficiency, suddenly became critical, and suddenly was in short supply. Freight rates spiked dramatically. The cost to ship a container from Asia to North America, it increased by 5 times, 10 times, sometimes even more. What had been cheap and predictable became expensive and uncertain. Businesses that depended on low shipping costs, they were suddenly facing unexpected expenses. Products became more expensive. Shortages appeared. The fragility of the system was exposed for all to see. What had seemed robust and reliable revealed itself to be vulnerable to disruption. And then, in March 2021, the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal. Picture this moment. A megaship, one of those enormous vessels we spoke of earlier, over 400 meters long. It ran aground in the Suez Canal. that vital shortcut between Asia and Europe. One ship, wedged sideways, blocking the entire canal. For 6 days, nothing could pass. Ships backed up on both sides, hundreds of vessels waiting, carrying thousands upon thousands of containers. All stopped, all delayed, because one ship had encountered difficulties in a narrow channel. Global trade stalled. The Suez Canal carries an enormous percentage of trade between Asia and Europe. With it blocked, ships had to choose: wait and hope it would be cleared quickly, or sail around Africa, adding weeks to their journey. Either way, delays rippled through the system. When the Ever Given was finally freed, when traffic resumed, the backlog took weeks to clear, and the delays cascaded. Ships arrived late at ports, missing their scheduled berth times, creating more congestion, more delays. The effects spread through the global system like ripples in water. The world noticed the container. Briefly, for a few weeks, a few months, people who had never thought about shipping suddenly understood. The things they wanted to buy were stuck on ships. Delayed imports. The invisible infrastructure became visible. But only because it wasn't working. News reports showed aerial footage of ports. Hundreds of ships at anchor. Container yards overflowing. People began to understand, in a way they never had before, how dependent modern life is on these steel boxes moving smoothly through a global system. But human attention is brief. As ports slowly cleared, as freight rates gradually declined, as goods began flowing again, the awareness faded. The container returned to invisibility. The crisis was treated as an aberration, a temporary disruption, rather than a revelation of inherent fragility. Let yourself understand both things at once. The container system is remarkably robust. It moves billions of tons of cargo every year with impressive reliability. But it's also fragile, vulnerable to disruption, optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. When things go wrong, when the unexpected happens, the effects can cascade rapidly through the entire global network. This fragility isn't a flaw in the traditional sense. It's the consequence of optimization. When you tune a system for maximum efficiency, when you eliminate all slack, all redundancy, all excess capacity, you create something that works beautifully under normal conditions, but struggles when conditions change. The pandemic and the Suez Canal incident. They revealed something important. The global economy, modern life, it rests on a foundation that's more delicate than most people realize. We've built a world that depends on containers moving smoothly, constantly, predictably. And when that flow is disrupted, even briefly, the effects are felt everywhere. Let this understanding settle softly. The container system, for all its sophistication, for all its scale, remains fundamentally vulnerable. Not because it's poorly designed, but because it's so central, so essential, so optimized that there's little room for error. Rest now with this knowledge, this reminder that even the most reliable systems have their limits, that efficiency and resilience sometimes pull in different directions. that the infrastructure we take for granted. It requires constant attention, constant adjustment, constant human wisdom to keep it working. The container will endure, the system will adapt, but the illusion of perfect reliability, that was shattered. And perhaps that's important to understand. Even the foundations of modern life, they are maintained by human effort, subject to human limitations, vulnerable in ways we forget until something goes wrong. As we drift further through this story, we must acknowledge something important, something that's easy to overlook when we focus on efficiency and progress. Every innovation, every system, comes with costs, some visible, some hidden. Let's explore this gently, with honesty and compassion. Container shipping contributes to emissions. Think about this softly. Those enormous ships crossing oceans, they burn fuel. Most of them still run on heavy fuel oil. A thick, dirty fuel that's essentially what's left after refining crude oil into cleaner products. And they burn vast quantities of it. Each container ship, particularly the megaships, produces emissions equivalent to millions of cars. Carbon dioxide, sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, particulates, all released into the atmosphere as these vessels cross the oceans. The environmental cost of moving goods globally, it's substantial. Now, it's important to understand nuance here. Larger ships improved per unit efficiency. A megaship carrying 20,000 containers produces far less emissions per container than a smaller ship carrying 1,000 containers. The efficiency gains are real. If you measure emissions per item transported, container shipping is remarkably efficient compared to other forms of transport. But, and this is important to hold gently, total emissions continued rising, because even as each ship became more efficient per container, the total volume of trade kept growing. More ships, more voyages, more containers. The efficiency improvements couldn't keep pace with the growth in trade volume. It's like driving a more fuel-efficient car, but driving it twice as far. You use less fuel per mile, but more fuel overall. The math is sobering when you look at the total environmental impact. There are other environmental concerns too. Containers were lost at sea, in storms, in accidents. Containers sometimes fall off ships, thousands of them each year, sinking to the ocean floor, or floating just beneath the surface, becoming navigation hazards, polluting marine environments with whatever they contain. Picture these lost containers gently, resting on the ocean floor, slowly degrading, their contents leaching into the water. It's a hidden cost, one that's rarely discussed. But it's real. It's ongoing. Port communities faced pollution. Those enormous container terminals. The ships coming and going constantly. The trucks queuing to pick up cargo. The diesel exhaust from cranes and straddle carriers. All of this creates air pollution that affects the people living nearby. Often, container ports are located in or near lower-income communities. Communities that bear the environmental burden while receiving fewer of the economic benefits. The noise, the air pollution, The truck traffic. These fall disproportionately on people with the least power to resist. And remember the dockworkers we met earlier in our story. Their world transformed permanently. Automation and efficiency meant fewer jobs. Different jobs. The communities that had been built around port labor. They had to adapt. Had to find new ways to survive. Some managed. Some struggled. The social cost of progress isn't always visible in statistics about efficiency and trade volume. Let's think about this with compassion. Progress often benefits some while costing others. The container revolution made goods cheaper, made global trade possible, enriched economies, but it also displaced workers, disrupted communities, increased environmental stress. Both things are true. We can acknowledge both without diminishing either. Regulations expanded. Societies began responding to these costs. Safety regulations, requirements for weight verification to prevent overloading, environmental rules about fuel quality and emissions. These regulations added complexity, added costs, but they were necessary attempts to address the negative consequences of containerization. Some ports began requiring cleaner fuels. Some countries mandated shore power, allowing ships to plug into electrical grids while in port rather than running their engines. Small steps, incremental improvements, trying to reduce harm even as the system continues to grow. The shipping industry itself has begun to change. Slowly, new ships are being designed with efficiency in mind. Some experimental vessels use LNG, liquefied natural gas, which burns cleaner than heavy fuel oil. Others are exploring hydrogen, or ammonia, or even wind-assisted propulsion. Returning to sails. But modern sails, computer-controlled, working alongside engines. These innovations are promising, but they take time. Ships last for decades. The fleet can't be replaced quickly, and the fundamental challenge remains. How do you maintain a global economy that depends on moving goods across oceans while reducing the environmental impact to sustainable levels? There are no easy answers. No simple solutions. The container enabled globalization, and globalization brought benefits and costs, inextricably linked. You cannot simply separate them, cannot keep only the good parts. As you drift through these thoughts, hold space for complexity, for understanding that progress is rarely pure, that innovations solve some problems while creating others, that the same system that brings you affordable goods from around the world also contributes to environmental challenges, to social disruption. The container didn't cause all of these problems. Many existed before, but containerization accelerated them, made them larger in scale, made them global rather than local. The questions we face now, about sustainability, about equity, about how to maintain prosperity while protecting the environment and supporting communities. These are partly questions created by the success of the container. Let this settle gently in your mind. The understanding that innovations are never purely good or purely bad. They change things, create new possibilities, new challenges, new responsibilities. The container transformed trade, but it also transformed our obligations to the environment, to workers, to communities affected by global commerce. Rest now with this complexity, this honest acknowledgement of costs alongside benefits, the environmental burden of moving goods globally, the social changes forced upon communities, the ongoing challenges of making this essential system more sustainable, more equitable, more aligned with human and planetary well-being. These are the questions we live with, the challenges we must address, the costs we must acknowledge even as we appreciate the benefits. All of it part of the full story, the complete picture of what the container revolution really means. Let's drift now to something unexpected, something beautiful in its way. The container, that simple steel box designed for moving cargo. It found a second life, a new purpose. After its shipping days were done, this is a gentler part of our story, where industrial objects become something else entirely. Retired containers were reused. Think about this softly. A container has a working life of about 10 to 15 years in shipping. After that, it might be too worn, too damaged, too costly to maintain for the rigorous demands of ocean transport. But the steel box itself, it's still solid, still weatherproof, still fundamentally useful. Rather than scrapping these retired containers, melting them down, people began seeing other possibilities. What if that steel box could be something else? What if its working life didn't have to end? Containers became homes. Picture this gently. A retired container, cleaned, insulated, fitted with windows and doors, transformed into living space. In some places, entire houses built from multiple containers, stacked and arranged, creating surprisingly comfortable homes. There's something appealing about this. The idea of taking an object that crossed oceans, that saw dozens of ports, that carried goods from factory to customer, and giving it a new life as someone's home. The container carries its history with it. The dents and scratches, the faded paint, traces of all the journeys it made. Container homes appeared in many places, sometimes as affordable housing solutions, using containers because they are relatively inexpensive and already designed to be structural units, sometimes as architectural statements, modern designs that showcase the industrial aesthetic of the container, celebrating rather than hiding its origins. They became offices and shops too. Picture a trendy coffee shop in a converted container. Its steel walls painted bright colors, large windows cut into the sides, the interior cozy despite, or perhaps because of, its industrial origins, or a small office, a startup company working in a space that was once cargo storage. The container providing shelter, character, a story. In some cities, entire developments emerged using containers. Food truck parks became shipping container restaurant courts. Retail centers built from stacked containers, each business occupying its own box. The containers creating a modular, flexible architecture that could be rearranged, expanded, adapted as needs changed. Containers entered architecture and art. Artists saw them as canvases, as sculptural elements, as materials for installation pieces. The container's industrial nature, its association with global commerce, made it meaningful, symbolic. Some artists created installations questioning consumption and globalization, using the very boxes that enabled global trade as a commentary on it. Others simply appreciated the form, the corrugated walls, the standardized dimensions, the way containers could be stacked and arranged. Architects embraced containers for temporary structures, disaster relief housing, pop-up shops and exhibitions, student housing. The container's portability, its stackability, its structural integrity, all the features that made it good for shipping also made it interesting for building. There's something poetic about this transformation. The box that was designed to be invisible, to simply move cargo efficiently from place to place, it became visible in a completely different way. Not as infrastructure, but as architecture, as living space, as art. The box outlived its original purpose. A container might spend 15 years in shipping service, crossing oceans hundreds of times, and then spend decades as a home, or an office, or a studio. Its second life potentially longer than its first. The utility of that simple steel box, 8 feet wide, 20 or 40 feet long. It extended far beyond what anyone originally imagined. Not every container gets this second life. Most retired containers are indeed scrapped, recycled for their steel. But enough are reused, repurposed, transformed, that containers have become a familiar sight in unexpected contexts. You might live near a container building without even realizing it. The boxes blend into the landscape of modern life in yet another way. Let your mind rest on this gentle irony. The container was designed to be standardized, interchangeable, forgettable, just a box among millions of identical boxes. But in their second lives, each converted container becomes unique, individual. Someone's home carries traces of its journeys, tells its own story through the wear and weathering of its steel walls. Picture one such container now. Perhaps it once carried electronics from Japan, then textiles from India, then machinery from Germany. Crossing the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, lifted by cranes in dozens of ports, secured in hundreds of different positions on different ships. And now it sits on land, permanently, transformed into a small cafe, its doors welded open, windows cut into its sides. Inside, comfortable chairs, warm lighting, the smell of coffee, people gathering, talking, never knowing the journeys this space once made, never thinking about the oceans it crossed, the ports it visited. The container serves, just as it always served, providing utility, solving problems, meeting needs. First as a way to move goods, now as a way to house people, to shelter businesses, to inspire artists. The fundamental usefulness of that simple steel box. It transcends any single purpose. Let this transformation drift through your mind. The way objects can have multiple lives. The way something designed for one purpose can find unexpected new meanings. The way the infrastructure of one era becomes the material of the next. Rest now with these images. Containers as homes, as shops, as art. The steel boxes that revolutionized trade. Quietly living on. Serving new purposes. Telling new stories. While carrying within them the memory of all the oceans they crossed. All the cargo they carried. All the ports they visited. In their first life as travelers of the world. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, drifting gently back to the present moment, to the world as it is now. Let's rest here together, understanding what the container has become, what it means, why this simple story of a steel box matters. Containers now carry most non-bulk trade. Think about that softly. When goods move between countries, when products travel across oceans, if it's not bulk cargo like oil or grain or coal, it's probably in a container. The box has become the default, the standard, the assumed way that things move through the world. Billions of tons move annually. Try to picture this gently, though the scale is almost beyond imagination. Billions of tons of cargo, millions of containers, crossing oceans, moving along railways, rolling down highways, all in constant motion. The global economy flowing through these standardized steel boxes. Nearly everything we own traveled in a box. Look around your space. The clothes you wear. The device you're listening on. The furniture you sit on. The food in your pantry. Almost all of it, at some point in its journey to you, rested inside a container, was lifted by a crane, was stacked on a ship, crossed an ocean sealed in steel. The container has become so fundamental to modern life that we can barely imagine the world without it. And yet, it's barely 70 years old. Within a single human lifetime, the entire infrastructure of global trade was transformed, rebuilt around this simple innovation. Containers are rarely noticed. This is perhaps the ultimate measure of their success. They work so reliably, so efficiently, so constantly, that they've become invisible. You don't think about the container that brought your phone from the factory. You don't wonder about the ship that carried your coffee across an ocean. You don't notice the trucks moving containers through the night while you sleep. The container has achieved what all great infrastructure achieves. It disappeared. It became background. It enabled everything while being noticed by no one. Yet modern life depends on them. Completely. Fundamentally. If container shipping stopped, even for a few weeks, the effects would be catastrophic. Store shelves would empty. Factories would shut down for lack of parts. The just-in-time systems that power modern manufacturing would collapse. We've built a world that assumes containers will always keep moving. The shipping container is one of history's most influential inventions. This is not an exaggeration, not hyperbole. When you consider its impact, how completely it reshaped global trade, how it enabled globalization, how it changed the geography of manufacturing and consumption. Few inventions in history have had such profound and far-reaching effects. It ranks alongside the printing press, the steam engine, the transistor, not because it's impressive in the way those technologies are impressive, but because of what it enabled, what it made possible. The container didn't just improve shipping. It fundamentally changed what was economically feasible, what was practical, what could exist. Not because it is impressive. This is important to understand. The container itself. It's just a box. Steel walls. Corner castings. Corrugated panels. There's nothing particularly sophisticated about it. No advanced technology. No complex systems. It's almost absurdly simple. And yet that simplicity, that's precisely why it works. Complex solutions often fail. They break down. They require constant adjustment. They are hard to maintain. But a steel box with standardized dimensions and corner fittings, it just works. Anywhere. Everywhere. Reliably. Year after year. Decade after decade. But because it works. This is the answer. This is why the container matters. Not because it's clever. Not because it's technologically advanced. But because it solved a real problem. Addressed a genuine need. And did so in a way that was practical. Scalable. Universal. The container works in Singapore and Seattle. In Rotterdam and Rio. In Tokyo and Tanzania. It works in all weather. All climates. All conditions. It works for electronics and for textiles. For machinery and for consumer goods. It works on ships and trains and trucks. It just works. And sometimes, often, the things that work, the innovations that truly change the world, they are not the flashy ones, not the ones that grab headlines, not the ones that seem revolutionary. They are the quiet ones, the simple ones, the ones that solve problems so effectively they become invisible. Let this understanding settle gently over you now. The story we've drifted through together. From the chaotic inefficiency of break bulk shipping, through the experiments and failures, to Malcolm McLean's vision, the ideal excess proof of concept, the standardization that made everything possible, the resistance and the triumph, the growth and the challenges, and finally to this moment, where containers flow constantly through a global system. Invisible. Essential. Taken for granted. You don't need to remember the details of this story. Don't hold on to dates or names or numbers. Just let the broad arc settle in your mind. The understanding that the world you live in, the global economy that surrounds you, the affordable goods, the international connections, the way distance has been rendered almost meaningless for trade. All of it rests on a foundation of simple steel boxes moving through a carefully coordinated system. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, containers are moving. Right now, at this very moment, ships are crossing oceans. Cranes are lifting boxes in ports. Trucks are delivering to warehouses. The system never stops, never sleeps, just continues its endless work. Connecting, moving, enabling. And in the morning, when you wake, it will still be working, still invisible, still taken for granted. The backbone of modern life, the foundation of global commerce, the simple innovation that changed everything. Not by being impressive, but by working reliably, efficiently, constantly. Let yourself rest now. Let this story drift away. You've journeyed with me through history, through innovation and resistance, through transformation and adaptation. You've seen how a simple idea, a steel box with standardized dimensions, reshaped the entire world. And now, let it all fade softly. The containers will keep moving while you sleep. The ships will keep sailing. The cranes will keep lifting. The system will keep working. You don't need to think about it. Don't need to hold on to it. Just let it all drift away like mist in the morning. Close your eyes now, or let them rest gently. Feel the comfort of knowing that some things, simple things, work so well they require no thought. The container moves through the world, and the world moves through your dreams. Both flowing, both constant, both reliable. Sleep now, peacefully. The story is complete. The journey is done. And tomorrow, when you wake, the containers will still be there, still moving, still working, still invisible. The quiet revolution that never ends. The simple box that changed everything. By doing nothing more, and nothing less, than working. Rest now. Let the story fade. Let sleep embrace you. The containers will keep moving. The world will keep turning. And you can simply rest.